Imagine for a moment that you're sitting in a bunker deep beneath the earth. The year is 1983. The Cold War is at its absolute peak. Tensions between the superpowers have never been higher, and suddenly every alarm in the room begins screaming at once. Red lights are flashing everywhere, and on the screens in front of you, you see something that makes your blood run cold. 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles are heading directly toward your country. You have less than half an hour before. They hit before millions of people are vaporized in nuclear fire, and the weight of the entire world now rests on your shoulders, because the decision you make in the next few minutes will determine whether humanity survives or whether we destroy ourselves in a global thermonuclear war. Now ask yourself this: what would you do? Would you trust a technology that's telling you the attack is real? Would you follow protocol and recommend an immediate counterstrike, launching thousands of nuclear weapons in retaliation, or would you hesitate? Would you doubt? Would you risk everything on a gut feeling that something isn't right? Because here's the terrifying truth. On September 26, 1983, this wasn't a hypothetical scenario. This actually happened. And a single man, a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces named Stanislav Petrov, had to make exactly this choice. Except almost nobody knows his name. History books barely mention him. There were no parades as honor, no medal ceremony, no international recognition for decades. And yet this one person, sitting at a computer terminal in a secret military facility called Serpukhov 15, literally prevented World War III from starting. He saved your life. He saved my life. He saved billions of lives that would have been lost in the nuclear exchange and the subsequent nuclear winter that would have followed. But here's what makes this story even more chilling. The Soviet early warning system wasn't just showing one missile. It was showing 5 confirmed launches coming from the United States. The computers were certain. The protocols were clear. The USSR had invested billions of rubles into this detection system specifically to prevent a surprise attack. And now it was telling them that the nightmare scenario they'd been preparing for had finally arrived. Every piece of technology, every safeguard, every redundant system was screaming that this was real, that America had just launched a first strike. And standard Soviet military doctrine was absolutely unambiguous about what should happen next. There was no room for debate, no time for committees or second opinions. The entire Soviet nuclear arsenal was supposed to be launched immediately in a massive retaliatory strike. Because if you wait, if you hesitate even for a few minutes, those incoming missiles will destroy your launch sites and you'll lose the ability to fight back. It's called launch on warning, and both superpowers had adopted this terrifying strategy because in the age of intercontinental ballistic missiles, you have maybe 20 to 30 minutes from detection to impact. That's not enough time to verify, not enough time to investigate, not enough time to be absolutely certain. You either trust your systems and launch everything you have, or you risk losing everything. So why didn't Stanislav Petrov push the button? Why didn't he pick up the phone and tell his superiors that the attack was confirmed and that they needed to launch immediately? What was going through his mind as he watched those missiles tracking across the screen, getting closer and closer to Soviet territory with every passing second? And here's the question that should terrify you. How many other times has this almost happened? How many other close calls have there been that we don't know about? How many times have we come within minutes or even seconds of accidental nuclear war? Because I can tell you right now, the Petrov incident wasn't the only one. It wasn't even the closest call. There have been multiple occasions throughout the Cold War, and even after where technical glitches, human errors, misunderstandings, and sheer bad luck nearly triggered the end of human civilization. And the really disturbing part is that most of these incidents were kept secret for years or even decades. They were classified, buried in military archives, hidden from the public because both the United States and the Soviet Union were terrified of admitting just how close they had come to destroying the world by accident. So as we go through this story, I want you to keep asking yourself, what would I have done? Would I have had the courage to doubt the machines, to question the protocol, to risk everything on my own judgment? And more importantly, why are we trusting the fate of human civilization to systems that can fail, to technologies that can glitch, to decisions that have to be made in minutes by exhausted officers in underground bunkers? Because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how fragile our existence really is, how we've been living on borrowed time for decades, and how one man's decision, made in the most stressful circumstances imaginable, is the only reason you're alive today to watch this. So stay with me, because what happened on that September night in 1983 is more terrifying, more complex, and more important than you could possibly imagine, and the lessons we need to learn from it are more relevant right now than ever before. Picture yourself back in that bunker with Stanislav Petrov. It's just past midnight on September 26, 1983. You've been on duty for hours already. You're tired. The night shift is always the worst. Your eyes are strained from staring at computer screens in the dim light. And then, without any warning whatsoever, the silence is shattered by alarms so loud they make your ears ring. The central computer system, called Oko, which means eye in Russian, has just detected a missile launch from the United States. Your heart is pounding. Adrenaline floods your system. This is the moment every Soviet officer has been trained for, but hoped would never come. Except here is where it gets worse. Within seconds, the system confirms not just one missile, but 5 separate intercontinental ballistic missiles have been launched and are now racing towards Soviet territory at over 15,000 miles per hour. You look at the screen and you can see the trajectories. You can see the estimated time to impact counting down. And you know with absolute certainty that if these missiles are real, if this attack is actually happening, then in approximately 25 minutes the first nuclear warheads will begin detonating over Soviet cities. Moscow could be hit. Leningrad could be hit. Millions of people could be about to die. And the responsibility for what happens next is entirely on you, because here's what nobody tells you about nuclear war protocols. The decision isn't made by the general, secretary sitting comfortably in the Kremlin. It's not made by the top military commanders. It's made by whoever's on duty when the alarm goes off. It's made by people like Petrov, mid-level officers who are supposed to follow a very simple chain of command. You see the missiles on your screen. You confirm the launch. You immediately pick up the phone and report to your superiors that an attack is underway, and then the Soviet nuclear forces begin their launch sequence. That's it. That's the protocol. There's no investigation, no verification process, no time to check if the satellites might be malfunctioning, because the entire Soviet strategy depends on being able to retaliate before your missiles are destroyed on the ground. So Petrov is sitting there, klaxons are blaring, officers around him are shouting. Everyone is looking at him because he's a duty officer. He's the one who has to make the call, and here's where his mind starts racing through a series of thoughts that will save the world. First, he thinks about the number of missiles. Only 5. Now, if you're going to launch a first strike against the Soviet Union, if you're actually trying to destroy their ability to retaliate, would you really only launch 5 missiles? The United States had thousands of nuclear weapons. They had Minuteman missiles in silos across the Midwest. They had submarine-launched ballistic missiles in the Atlantic and Pacific. They had bombers ready to take off at a moment's notice. So, why would they start World War III with just 5 missiles? It doesn't make tactical sense. It doesn't match any war plan that Petrov has studied. A real first strike would be massive, overwhelming, hundreds or even thousands of missiles launched simultaneously to catch the Soviets off guard and destroy as many of their launch sites as possible before they could respond. 5 missiles seem more like a malfunction than an actual attack. But here's the problem. Petrov can't be sure. Maybe this is just the first wave. Maybe the American strategy has changed. Maybe they're testing Soviet response times. Maybe the other missiles just haven't been detected yet. And while he's thinking all of this through, precious seconds are ticking away. Every moment he delays is a moment when those missiles, if they're real, are getting closer to their targets. His subordinates are staring at him, waiting for orders. The protocol is crystal clear. He's supposed to report the attack immediately. But something in his gut is telling him that this doesn't feel right. And then he starts looking at the actual data more carefully. The missiles were supposedly detected by satellites that use infrared sensors to spot the heat signature of rocket launches. But here's what Petrov knows about those satellites. They're not perfect. They've had problems before. There have been false positives, glitches, moments where the system thought it saw something that wasn't really there. And on this particular night, the satellites are looking down at the United States at an angle where the sun is reflecting off clouds in a very specific way. Could the system be mistaking sunlight reflecting off cloud tops for the heat signature of missile launches? It's possible. It's definitely possible. But if he's wrong, if he convinces himself this is a false alarm and it's not, then he's just given the United States 25 minutes to destroy the Soviet Union. Without any retaliation, he'll be responsible for the deaths of hundreds of millions of Soviet citizens. He'll go down in history as a man who let his country be destroyed because he didn't follow protocol. Can you even imagine that pressure? Can you imagine having to make that choice, knowing that either way you could be responsible for an unimaginable catastrophe? If you report the attack and it's real, you help start a nuclear war that kills billions of people worldwide. If you don't report it and it's real, you let your own country be destroyed without fighting back. And you have maybe 2 or 3 minutes to decide before your superiors start calling and demanding to know what's happening. So Petrov makes a decision that goes against every instinct, every piece of training, every protocol he's been taught. He decides that this is a false alarm. He decides to trust his intuition over the technology. He picks up the phone and reports to his superiors that the system has malfunctioned, that there is no attack. And then he waits, watching the clock, watching the screens, knowing that if he's wrong, he'll know in about 20 minutes when the first warheads start detonating. Can you imagine those 20 minutes? Sitting there, wondering if you've just made the biggest mistake in human history, wondering if nuclear explosions are about to light up the Soviet Union, wondering if you're about to be vaporized along with everyone else in the bunker. His hands are shaking. He's sweating. Other officers in the facility are confused and scared because the alarms are still going off. The system is still showing missiles inbound, but Petrov has reported it as a false alarm, and now everyone is just waiting to see if he's right or if they're all about to die. And here's something that makes this even more terrifying. Petrov later admitted that he wasn't entirely certain he was right. He said he was maybe 50-50. He didn't have proof that it was a false alarm. He couldn't definitively say the missiles weren't real. He just had a feeling, an intuition based on his experience and his analysis of the situation. And he bet the entire world on that feeling. 20 minutes pass, then 25, then 30. No missiles hit, no nuclear explosions, no attack. The system eventually recognizes that there are no missiles and the alarms stop. Petrov was right. It was a false alarm. The satellites had indeed mistaken sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds for missile launches. A glitch, a technical error, a perfect storm of circumstances that created a signature that looked exactly like an American first strike. And the only thing standing between that glitch and World War III was one man who decided to trust his judgment over the machines. But here's what happened next that shows you just how screwed up the situation really was. Petrov didn't get a medal. He didn't get a promotion. He didn't get praise for saving the world. Instead, he got reprimanded. His superior officers were angry that he hadn't followed protocol exactly, angry that he had filed paperwork incorrectly during the incident, angry that he had made them look bad by exposing the flaws in the satellite warning system. He was quietly pushed into early retirement. His story was kept classified for years, and he spent the rest of his life in relative obscurity, living in a small apartment on a tiny pension. And when journalists finally discovered what he had done and started calling him a hero, Petrov himself was uncomfortable with the title. He said he was just doing his job, that he didn't feel like he deserved special recognition for simply not starting a nuclear war. But I want you to think about what this means. Think about the fact that we came that close to extinction because of a computer glitch. Think about the fact that our survival depended on one person's willingness to break protocol and trust his gut. And think about how many other people in that same situation would have followed the rules, would have picked up the phone and reported the attack is real, would have set in motion the events that would have ended human civilization. How many other officers would have made the opposite choice? And more importantly, how do we know that next time, if there's a next time, we'll be lucky enough to have someone like Petrov on duty? Now, let's talk about what actually went wrong that night and why it's so much more disturbing than just a simple computer error. Because when you dig into the technical details of how the Soviet early warning system failed, you start to realize that this wasn't just bad luck. It was a system that was fundamentally flawed from the very beginning, built on technology that wasn't ready, deployed too quickly because of political pressure, and trusted with the fate of humanity despite everyone involved knowing it had serious problems. So let me take you inside the Oko satellite system and show you exactly how close we came to annihilation because of decisions made years before that September night. The Soviet Union had launched its first early warning satellites in the 1970s because they were terrified of a surprise American nuclear attack. They knew the United States had thousands of missiles that could reach Soviet territory in about 30 minutes. And 30 minutes is not enough. Time to make careful decisions. It's barely enough time to get your leadership to safety and launch a counterstrike. So the Soviets needed to detect American missile launches the moment they happened, which meant they needed satellites equipped with infrared sensors that could spot the incredibly hot exhaust plumes of rockets as they lifted off from silos or submarines. Sounds simple enough, right? You point satellites at America, you watch for the heat signature of launching missiles. If you see them, you sound the alarm. Except here's the problem. Infrared sensors don't just detect missile launches. They detect anything that's hot and bright. They can be triggered by the sun, by reflections off clouds, by fires on the ground, by the way sunlight hits the Earth's atmosphere at certain angles, and distinguishing between a real missile launch and a false positive requires incredibly sophisticated software and multiple layers of verification. Software that in 1983 was nowhere near as advanced as it needed to be. The Oko satellites were essentially looking down at the Earth with sensors that could see heat, and they were programmed to recognize patterns that match what a missile launch should look like, a sudden bright spot that moves upward very quickly. But the system had limitations that the Soviet engineers knew about but couldn't fully solve. For one thing, the satellites weren't in ideal orbits. They were in highly elliptical orbits called Molniya orbits that kept them over the northern hemisphere for most of their time, which was good for watching the United States, but meant they were looking at the Earth from constantly changing angles and distances. And these changing angles created opportunities for false readings, especially during certain times of day when the sun was positioned in just the wrong way. The engineers who built the system had warned about this. They had said that reflections off high-altitude clouds could potentially trigger false alarms, especially during dawn and dusk when sunlight was hitting cloud at low angles. But here's where the political pressure comes in. The Soviet leadership wanted the system operational as quickly as possible. They were in an arms race with the United States. They were paranoid about American intentions, and they didn't want to wait years for a perfect system when they could have a working system right now. So the Oko satellites were deployed, even though the people building them knew the technology wasn't mature enough, knew the software had vulnerabilities, knew that false alarms were possible and maybe even probable under certain conditions. But they deployed it anyway because the alternative, having no early warning system at all, seemed even more dangerous. And this is something you need to understand about the Cold War. Both sides were making decisions based on fear, based on worst-case scenarios, based on the assumption that the other side was always on the verge of attacking. And that fear led to systems being rushed into service before they were ready, to protocols being established that didn't leave room for human judgment, to a situation where we were one technical glitch away from extinction, and everybody involved kind of knew it, but felt trapped by the logic of nuclear deterrence. So on that night in September 1983, several things went wrong simultaneously in a way that created a perfect storm. First, one of the Oko satellites was passing over the United States at exactly the moment when the sun was at a particular angle relative to the Earth. This created a situation where sunlight was reflecting off the tops of high-altitude clouds in the American Midwest, and the infrared sensors on the satellite saw these reflections as sudden bright spots that appeared and moved in a way that looked similar to missile launches. Now the system should have been able to filter this out. There were supposed to be algorithms that could distinguish between cloud reflections and actual rocket exhaust. But here's the problem. The software wasn't sophisticated enough. It was making decisions based on relatively simple pattern matching, and the pattern it saw that night matched his understanding of what a missile launch looked like closely enough to trigger an alarm. But it gets worse. The satellite system should have had redundancy. There should have been other satellites that could verify what the first one was seeing. There should have been ground-based radar systems that could confirm the presence of incoming missiles. Except here's what the Soviets discovered that night. Their early warning network had gaps. The satellites weren't positioned well enough to provide complete coverage. The ground radar systems couldn't see missiles until they were much closer, and the communication systems between different parts of the network weren't good enough to quickly correlate data and figure out what was really happening. So Petrov was looking at data from essentially one source, one satellite that was saying it saw 5 missiles, and he had no way to quickly verify that information. He couldn't call up a different satellite and ask if it saw the same thing. He couldn't check with ground radar because the missiles, if they were real, weren't close enough yet to be detected by radar. All he had was a word or computer system that he knew had problems, and his own intuition telling him something wasn't right. And here's the really chilling part. After the incident was over and Soviet engineers investigated what had gone wrong, they found that this exact scenario Sunlight, reflecting off clouds at certain angles, had been identified as a potential problem years earlier. It was in the documentation. People knew it could happen, but nothing had been done to fix it. Maybe because fixing was too expensive. Maybe because it would have required redesigning the satellites. Maybe because the political leadership didn't want to admit the system had flaws. Or maybe just because in a massive bureaucracy like the Soviet military, warnings get lost and problems get ignored until something catastrophic happens. Except in this case, something catastrophic almost happened but didn't. And instead of leading to major reforms, instead of leading to a complete overhaul of the early warning system, the incident was quietly swept under the rug. Petrov was pushed out, the satellite system continued operating with the same flaws, and the world moved on without ever knowing how close it had come to ending. But let me tell you what really keeps me up at night about this. It's not just that the technology failed. It's that we built a system where technology failure automatically means nuclear war. We created a situation where computers have to make life and death decisions for the entire planet. And we gave those computers maybe 20 or 30 minutes to be absolutely certain before launching weapons that would kill billions of people. And we did this knowing that computers make mistakes, knowing that sensors can be fooled, knowing that software has bugs, knowing that no technology is perfect. And yet we still build a system that requires perfection because the alternative, giving humans more time to think and verify and investigate, means potentially losing the ability to retaliate. And this gets to the fundamental insanity of nuclear deterrence. It only works if both sides believe that any attack will automatically trigger massive retaliation, which means you can't have long, careful decision-making processes. You can't have committees that meet and debate and verify information. You have to have a hair trigger system that can launch thousands of missiles in minutes. And that means you have to trust the technology. You have to trust that the satellites are seeing what they claim to be seeing. You have to trust that the software is interpreting the data correctly. And you have to have officers who will follow protocol even when their instincts are screaming that something is wrong. Except Petrov didn't follow protocol. He trusted his instincts over the technology. And that's the only reason we're here. But here's the question we need to ask. How many times can we get lucky? How many times can we depend on having the right person in the right place at the right time who will make the right decision against all protocols and procedures? Because I can tell you right now, the Petrov incident wasn't the last close call. It wasn't the last time technology failed or humans made mistakes or circumstances aligned in dangerous ways. There have been other incidents since 1983, other moments where we've come terrifyingly close to accidental nuclear war, and some of those incidents involved technology that was supposed to be better than what Petrov was using, more advanced, more reliable, less prone to false alarms. And yet the false alarms kept happening, the close calls kept happening, and we keep trusting these systems with our survival, even though they keep proving they're not trustworthy. So when I tell you that a radar glitch almost started World War III, I'm not just talking about one incident in 1983. I'm talking about a fundamental flaw in how we've organized our nuclear forces, a flaw that persists to this day, a flaw that means right now, as you're watching this, there are early warning systems monitoring the skies, and those systems could malfunction, could see something that isn't there, could trigger alarms that put us right back in the same situation Petrov faced. And we have to hope that whoever is on duty will make the same choice he did, will question the technology, will trust their judgment, will risk everything on being right. And that is not a sane way to organize human civilization. That is not a rational way to manage weapons that could end all life on Earth. And yet here we are, still living under the same basic system, still trusting technology that we know can fail, still depending on luck and the courage of individuals to save us from our own systems. So what happened after that night? What happened to Stanislav Petrov, the man who literally saved the world? And why should we care about a story from 1983 when we're living in 2025? Because the answer to these questions reveals something deeply disturbing about how we treat the people who save us, how we think about nuclear weapons, and how vulnerable we still are right now to the exact same kind of accident that almost killed everyone 42 years ago. Let's start with Petrov himself. After that September night, when he refused to report the missile attack as real, when he broke protocol and trusted his gut and turned out to be right, you would think he'd be celebrated. You would think the Soviet government would have recognized that this man had just prevented World War III, that he had saved hundreds of millions of Soviet citizens from nuclear annihilation, that he deserved the highest honors a country could bestow. Except that's not what happened at all. Instead, Petrov was called into his superior's office and reprimanded. He was criticized for not properly logging the incident in the correct paperwork, for failing to follow exact procedures during the crisis, and most importantly, for exposing the fact that the Oko satellite system had serious flaws. Because here's what the Soviet military leadership cared about. They cared about looking competent. They cared about protecting their reputations. They cared about hiding the fact that they had spent billions of rubles on an early warning system that could mistake clouds for missiles. And Petrov's actions, by questioning the system and being proven right, made them all look bad. It showed that the technology they had championed wasn't reliable. It showed that the protocols they had established weren't adequate. And it raised uncomfortable questions about how many other times the system might fail. So rather than celebrating Petrov, they quietly pushed him aside. He was transferred to a less prestigious position. He was passed over for promotions, and eventually took early retirement in 1984, just a year after the incident. And here's the really heartbreaking part. Petrov left military service with almost nothing. He received a small pension that was barely enough to live on. He moved into a modest apartment outside Moscow, and he spent years in obscurity, unknown to the world, unknown even to most people in Russia. The Soviet government kept the entire incident classified. They didn't want anyone to know how close they had come to launching their nuclear arsenal based on a false alarm. They didn't want the United States to know that their early warning system was unreliable, and they certainly didn't want their own people questioning whether the leadership could be trusted with nuclear weapons. So Petrov's story remained secret for years, buried in classified files, and the man himself was left to live out his life in quiet anonymity. But then something changed in the late 1990s. After the Soviet Union had collapsed, details of the incident started to leak out. Russian military officers who had known about it began talking. Documents were declassified, and journalists started investigating. And when they tracked down Petrov and asked him about what had happened that night in September 1983, the world finally learned about the man who had saved them, and suddenly Petrov became an international figure. He was invited to the United Nations. He received awards from various peace organizations. A documentary was made about him, and people started calling him the man who saved the world. But here's what struck me when I read interviews with Petrov from this period. He was deeply uncomfortable with the attention. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He said over and over again that he was just doing his job, that any competent officer would have made the same decision, that he didn't deserve special recognition for simply not starting a nuclear war. And there's something almost tragic about that humility, because the truth is that not every officer would have made the same decision. Most officers, faced with alarms blaring and computers showing incoming missiles and protocols demanding immediate reporting, would have followed the rules, would have picked up a phone and set World War III in motion. Petrov was special precisely because he was willing to question the system, to trust his judgment over the technology, to risk everything on being right. And yet he spent most of his life poor and forgotten, living in a small apartment with a refrigerator that barely worked and a pension that forced him to grow vegetables in a garden just to have enough food. This is how we treated the man who saved billions of lives. We let him live in near poverty while the military officers who had criticized him and pushed him out enjoyed comfortable retirements with full honors. And when the world finally recognized what he had done, it was too late for him to really benefit from it. He was already old, already in poor health, already carrying the psychological burden of that decision for decades. Because make no mistake, that night in September 1983 left scars on Petrov. He later talked about how stressful it was, how he second-guessed himself for years, how he wondered what would have happened if he had been wrong, how he carried the weight of knowing that his decision had literally determined whether human civilization survived. Can you imagine living with that? Can you imagine lying, awake at night thinking about how you almost either started a nuclear war or failed to warn your country about a real attack? Thinking about how billions of lives hung on a decision you made in a few minutes based on incomplete information and a gut feeling. Petrov died in 2017 at the age of 77. And here's something that tells you everything you need to know about how forgotten he was. His death wasn't even reported for months. He died in May and the world didn't find out until September. He was buried in a simple grave with almost no ceremony. And if it hadn't been for a few journalists and peace activists who had stayed in touch with him, his death might have gone completely unnoticed. The man who saved the world died alone and forgotten, and that should make us angry. It should make us question our priorities as a species. But here's what should make us even more angry. Nothing fundamental has changed since 1983. We still have thousands of nuclear weapons on high alert. We still have early warning systems that can malfunction. We still have protocols that require split-second decisions based on imperfect information. And we're still trusting that when the next crisis comes, when the next false alarm happens, when the next technological glitch or human error or perfect storm of circumstances occurs, we'll have someone like Petrov on duty who will make the right call, except we can't count on that. We can't build the survival of human civilization on the hope that we'll get lucky again. Because here's what's happened since 1983. There have been other close calls, other incidents where false alarms or miscommunications or technical failures almost triggered nuclear war. In 1995, Russian early warning systems detected what they thought was a submarine-launched ballistic missile heading toward Moscow. It turned out to be a Norwegian scientific rocket, studying the aurora borealis. But for several minutes, Russian leadership was preparing to launch a counterstrike. President Yeltsin had the nuclear briefcase open and was being briefed on retaliation options. And the only reason World War III didn't start was because they waited just long enough to realize the trajectory of the rocket didn't match an attack profile. That was just 12 years after Petrov, with supposedly better technology, supposedly better protocols. And we still almost destroyed ourselves. And there have been other incidents that we probably don't even know about yet, because both Russia and the United States and now other nuclear powers keep these things classified for years or decades. We only find out how close we came to extinction long after the fact, when documents are declassified or when people involved finally feel free to talk. And every time we learn about another close call, another near miss, another moment when human civilization almost ended by accident, we should be asking ourselves why we still have these systems, why we still maintain nuclear arsenals that can destroy the world many times over, why we still trust technology and protocols that keep failing. But instead, we mostly just forget about it. We move on with our lives. We assume that someone somewhere is making sure we're safe, that the systems work, that the people in charge know what they're doing. Except the Petrov incident proves that's not true. It proves that the systems don't always work, that the people in charge make mistakes, that we survive as much by luck as by design. And it proves that when we do survive, when someone does make the right decision and saves all, we don't even properly thank them. We certainly don't change the systems that put us in danger in the first place. We just classify the incident, push the whistleblower aside, and continue on as if nothing happened. So here's what I want you to take away from this story. First, Stanislav Petrov deserves to be remembered. His name should be taught in every history class. Every school child should. Know about the man who saved the world, because his story is a reminder of how fragile our existence is and how much we owe to individuals who have the courage to question authority and trust their judgment. Second, the fact that Petrov was treated so poorly by his government and forgotten by history for so long should make us think about how we value the people who truly make a difference, how we often celebrate the wrong people and ignore the real heroes. And third, and most importantly, the fact that we're still using the same basic nuclear strategies and early warning systems that almost destroyed us in 1983 should terrify you. It should make you angry. It should make you demand that your political leaders take nuclear weapons more seriously, that they invest in better verification systems, that they step back from high-alert postures that require split-second decisions, that they work toward actually reducing and eventually eliminating nuclear arsenals instead of just managing them. Because the alternative is that we keep playing Russian roulette with human civilization. We keep trusting that the next time there's a false alarm or a computer glitch or miscommunication, we'll have another Petrov on duty, someone who will question the system, someone who will trust their gut, someone who will be willing to risk everything on being right. And maybe we will. Maybe we'll get lucky again. Maybe the next close call will also end without missiles being launched. But do you really want to bet the survival of everyone you love, everyone you've ever known, everyone who will ever be born in the future, on luck, on chance, on the hope that we'll always have the right person in the right place at the right time? Because that's what we're doing right now. Every single day that we maintain these nuclear arsenals and these dangerous protocols, we're betting human civilization on luck, and eventually, inevitably, luck runs out. Stanislav Petrov gave us a second chance. He bought us time. He showed us what can go wrong and how close we can come to destroying ourselves. And the question is, what are we going to do with that second chance? Are we going to keep making the same mistakes? Keep trusting the same flawed systems? Keep hoping that luck will save us again? Or are we finally going to wake up and realize that the only way to prevent nuclear war is to eliminate the weapons that make it possible? Because if we don't, if we keep going down this path, then eventually there will be another crisis, another false alarm, another moment when someone has to make an impossible decision in a few minutes with incomplete information. And next time, we might not be lucky enough to have a Stanislav Petrov on duty. Next time, the person might follow protocol, might trust the technology, might make a decision that seems safest in the moment, but ends human civilization. And if that happens, there won't be anyone left to tell the story. There won't be anyone left to learn the lesson. There will just be silence where there used to be 8 billion people with hopes and dreams and futures. So remember Stanislav Petrov. Remember what he did. Remember what he sacrificed. And remember that the only reason you're alive to hear the story is because one man, 42 years ago, had the courage to doubt the machines and trust himself. And then ask yourself what you're going to do to make sure we never have to depend on that kind of luck again.